Our next speaker is Tonacia. Now, Katie is a former nurse working in a variety of roles, including accident and emergency and medical imaging. She took up a position with the Australian Federal Police in 2006. In the same year, Katie's husband David was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following an international deployment. This experience led to Katie to establish Picking Up the Pieces, an organisation which provides support to all uniformed service personnel and families struggling with PTSD and associated mental health issues. In 2011, Katie received the prestigious Winston Churchill Fellowship Award, where she researched the stigma surrounding uniformed service personnel and post-traumatic stress. Following Katie's fellowship, she rewrote the manual on mental health education for Picking Up the Pieces, and the education has now been delivered into high-risk work environments such as the Australian Federal Police International Deployment Group, the Australian Capital Territory Fire and Rescue, the Australian Capital Territory Ambulance Service, the Melbourne Fire Brigade, and many other organisations. Katie was awarded the Medal in the Order of Australia for her contributions to mental health. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Katie, who will talk to us on addressing stigma and misconceptions about PTSD.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, this is quite a momentous occasion for me, because in 2006 my husband boarded a plane one way and pretty well came back off it another, and that's where the idea of picking up the pieces eventuated. And we often talk about, the bright slide, sorry. We often talk about stigma and misconceptions and what that actually means. And I really believe that some of the misconceptions is what's leading to stigma. So you look at Irving Goffman, I think defined it well, stigma is a process by which reaction of others spoils normal identity. In terms of recovery and looking at bits and pieces through just our own personal experience and then what I'd actually witnessed within a uniformed service culture, it gave me a fairly good indication as to how damaging stigma can actually be. So I've just got to find my little clicker thing. I think what we'll do is just, if I was to go in to the effects of stigma, we would need a 4-day conference just to attack the whole thing around stigma. I was fortunate enough in part of my fellowship to actually attend the World Stigma Conference over in Canada in Ottawa, and it was without a doubt one of the most fascinating conferences I've been to. I have attended quite a few conferences throughout my sort of career in various things, but it was one of the things that actually really showed how we need to really actually start and address stigma as a matter of priority. So there are many types of stigma, and in terms of saying that, I'm just going to basically go over a brief outcome of this whole problem that we have. I was really pleased to hear some Rakesh talk in his talk just then in regards to, stigma is only a very small part of, about barriers to help seeking. So, but it is certainly an issue that we need to actually collaborate on and address. So I'll just go through this very briefly. I think I've got a little flicky thing. Did that work? Personal stigma. So personal stigma is really basically the thoughts and beliefs and attitudes about other people. So it might be, people with PTSD are bludgers, or it's just an excuse for bad behaviour, or, they're just trying to rip off the system. And these are conversations that, we've probably educated over 2,000 people at least. And quite often there'll be conversations or people will come up to us afterwards, and these are things that are actually said. And then there's also what I call is a perceived stigma. So what people think and believe others feel about them. So someone might be battling a mental health issue, and it's like, well, what are people thinking about me? Do they think I'm mad? Do they think I'm, a nutter? Am I schizo? All these things. So it's what people believe there. And then there's what is unintentional stigma. Oh, just move that up a bit. Unintentional stigma. And I think this is really quite unique in looking at what that actually means. You'll notice that I've got little sort of prompts next to it: language, caring, family, friends, conversations and comparisons. In terms of unintentional stigma, that is the stuff that we all do, and we've probably all done it inadvertently without even thinking about it. So language plays a very big part, and I will come back to that a little bit further in the slides. But language is huge, and how we use our language. I was so pleased when Tony addressed the beginning of this conference and had post-traumatic stress. That was one of the first things we did in picking up the pieces, was drop the disorder off the end of it, because it's a fairly derogative word. We know it's PTSD, we know that that's it in the DSM-5, but we've dropped it off. And it's just language. Unintentional stigma can be very, very huge in terms of people, caring family members, that are very in love with people that are suffering with PTSD or any mental illness as such. But, the whole caring, I'll give you a perfect example. We can send our people off to have some of the best care. They can attend St John of God Hospital and all these wonderful things. And then in the moment that they come home, because family just are trying to do the best, they don't completely understand what that person has been through. So there might be a bit of stigma in terms of that. We have a wedding coming up, but do we invite John that's got PTSD? Is he going to drink too much, or is he going to make a scene? So there's unintentional stigma without it even being realised. Family and friends. We talk about conversations. This is very huge. In one of the organisations that we delivered education out to in Canberra, which was the fire service, and their leadership in terms of mental health is absolutely fantastic. And I remember sitting down talking to one of the fellows there, and they have this beautiful saying, and there's no malice in it, and it's not a hurtful thing, but they talk about if somebody is off psychologically or feeling, off ill, whether it be PTSD or any sort of mental health difficulty, they talk about them being off in the head bin. So, and I was really quite puzzled when I first heard that. So John has gone off and John is in the head bin. So John's in the bin. And when you start to think about that, that is perfectly normal. That's what they talk about. I know with coppers, it's, someone's a broken biscuit. So these are all the sorts of languages that we talk about. The other thing is comparisons in terms of stigma. We do education out, as we said, to high-risk work organisations. And the one thing that we don't do is ever discuss trauma, ever discuss what had happened. And there's a couple of reasons around that. One of them is, obviously, the people that are delivering it out are lived experience. Rakesh talked a little bit about using or utilising people with a lived experience. The second one around that is we don't know what anybody has done in our background, like in the background that we're delivering to. And the third one is it almost leads to stigma because, PTSD is PTSD, it is what it is. So whether it be you've deployed to Afghanistan 9 times or you've been hurt in a field accident, if it's happened, it's happened. And what we're finding is if there's a comparison in how someone contracted PTSD, then it will stop people coming forward. Do I have a right to come forward? I don't feel, I haven't deployed to Afghanistan 9 times. So these are all the sorts of things that we take into consideration when we're looking at the education. And this is a big one. I didn't know whether to call it systemic stigma or structural stigma. And this is the stigma that we look at within sort of overall arching of everything from our insurance companies, organisational culture, government funding and mental health care. So in terms of, I'm a big believer, I never discuss insurance or anything like that, and certainly not in terms of when we're educating. But I think in a forum like this is probably a really good place to actually start this conversation. In terms of benefits or in terms of people that are requiring assistance, insurance companies, you break your femur, you're going to be looked after straight away. I've heard of people having to wait up to 2-3 years to have a claim processed, and that's just terrible because that's that early intervention that people need that needs to be assisted. So that's one thing that I'd love to see at the beginning of a forum like this start to change the systems around that. Organisational culture is very huge, and I talk very much about leadership at the end of it. Leadership or mental health leadership is absolutely an absolute priority, I think, in terms of trying to combat some of our stigma and the conversations that we have. It's going to come down to solid mental health leadership and having systems put in place. I might even just skip past that a little bit because I do talk about it at the end. One thing is the dangers of self-imposed stigma, and this was something that was very unique that came out of the World Stigma Conference, was how dangerous is it? Because people start to believe and tie in all these things around, you know, am I a nutter? I can't come forward. I don't want to step forward. You know, I'm going to lose my career. There are all these wonderful, nasty things that come into play, and that's when people can become, you know, that's where suicidal ideation can start to come in. I've noticed, or you'll notice I've put social identity down the bottom there. When I was actually doing my fellowship, I got to meet some really amazing people, and one of them in particular was a lady over in the UK. And she talked about the social identity of our uniformed service personnel. Like Tony, we started picking up the pieces predominantly to look after uniformed service members. And there seems to be a social identity that comes with wearing uniform. You put that uniform on, you go out, and these are our people that are running into danger. So it's very, very hard to run into the doctor's surgery if you're not coping so well because of the strong culture that goes in terms with one of those careers. So anyway, I'll keep going along. So in terms of the effects of stigma, I'm just going to, you know, there's not a person in this room that will not understand this, and you're here because of, you know, we want to raise awareness around PTSD, but we know the effects of stigma is probably the main barrier to help-seeking behaviour. And in terms of that, these are all the things that can actually flow on and have a flow-on effect. So we know that there can be an increase of symptoms because of the effects of stigma, because people are not getting treated. Anticipating stigma and discrimination, you know, anticipating I'm not going to come forward because if I do, I'm going to be judged, I'm going to be looked at differently. I may lose my career. The effects on self-esteem, well, we know if you're not treated. So it all basically, I'm not going to go through it all, but all of that basically goes through to that barrier of help-seeking behaviour. So let's look in terms of economic loss and, associated with the stigma. You know, we all know that there's a huge financial cost to not only people and individuals, but certainly our economy. I think this is a big one. There's a loss of organisational reputation, and you know, you only have to see some of the various media articles that go on through, whether it be through defence or policing organisations or whatever it is, because people are, you know, sort of a little bit cranky. Is, you know, why aren't they doing more? Why can't they do this? And that becomes stigmatised. It's huge. So I think the organisations in themselves become stigmatised. There's a disproportionate funding for research. I know that you know, if you look at the funding against physical illness as opposed to mental health in general, it is very disproportionate, and hopefully in time that will start to change. We look at the burden of disease costs increase due to mortality and morbidity. We know, and you know, our expert panels are going to be up here discussing this, we know that the earlier that PTSD is identified and treated, the much better the outcome. But because it's not getting treated and people are waiting until they're very, very unwell, it's a lot harder to treat. So that's obviously going to increase the burden of disease. We know that there's an underinvestment in the mental health care sector in terms of mental health in general. Increasing compensation claims and premiums for businesses. This is because people, as I mentioned before, people are waiting far too long to step forward. It's not until they're really quite crook. You know, I'll just do that one more deployment and then I'll go and seek help, or I'll just go and do, you know, I'll get it sorted. And these are the conversations that we've had over time in terms of the education that we've been doing. And I believe mental health difficulties broaden, and we know that through various studies that have gone on that it's quite intergenerational. So, you know, it's worth really investing some really good funding into looking at stigma. And the other thing that's pretty big for us is the loss of corporate knowledge that seems to be walking out the door that I believe is unnecessary. We have some very, very talented, well-educated, brilliant people that are diagnosed with PTSD and can work functionally. Not everybody is, you know, there is such a broad scale. Treated well and, you know, good systems in place, I don't believe we're going to lose all that corporate knowledge. So I want to talk about this a little bit here, and this goes back to some of the stuff that we do. It probably makes no sense sitting there, but I'll talk about it. As I said, we go into high-risk organisations and deliver education using the lived experience. We've realised, or we know through research, that that's been quite effective at trying to reduce stigma. We're not there to actually educate about PTSD, we're more there about trying to reduce the stigma to have people to come forward earlier. So in terms of this pie chart that I put here, we went into the police force and we delivered education out to, I think it was about 126 policing personnel that were about to deploy. So this was prior to them deploying. So, and we asked, we take a lot of qualitative, quantitative evaluations through doing that. And what was really quite interesting is 81% of the 120, so there was 126 I think, 120 answered the question. Out of that, there was no change in anybody's point of view of how they felt about PTSD. And I believe the no change, is probably all the people that we're sitting here today that really want to see a difference, want to change, understand it, and have a fairly good handle on what's going on. In the red, there was a little more positive, so that sat at about 33%. But what was really interesting was, overall, was a lot more positive. So after we had gone in and presented the information, we were able to see a massive change in the data in terms of how people viewed PTSD. And that's fantastic because in it we talk about how do you have that conversation with someone that you're concerned about? How, what is help-seeking behaviour? What are some of the signs and symptoms? So I was really quite impressed with that. I know with the fire brigade it sat around about 79%, and what we're hoping to do is collate all the data that we've put together into one research paper to be able to say this is a reasonably effective method at trying to reduce stigma. The role of the media. So, oh dear. Our media, we know our media is probably our best conduit for breaking down the stigma, and that is because we can have a far reach at our population, huge reach. It's very interesting. I woke up this morning and I scratched my head and I turned on the TV and I went, no one's wearing orange ribbons. I sent out, I don't know how many orange ribbons to every single television station to see if they'd at least wear the orange ribbons in support of this forum happening today. And I didn't see really anyone wearing them. And I went, well, how are we going to do that? Like, how do we actually address that? And I wish I had a better answer. And hopefully after this forum and the full, when we have our discussion and moving forward from tomorrow, this will be something that we can address. The other thing is appealing to the media to relay appropriate messages. Interesting. I'm not sure, there's probably some people in the room that may remember, and I know Professor Bryant probably will because he went in and actually put out the flames. But there was a TV show, I think it's called Studio 10, and they got up and there's a panel on there and they decided that they'd have this big discussion on PTSD and how people were trying to rot the system and it was an excuse for bad behaviour. Social media went crazy. There was emails in everywhere. And what was good about that, although that was a really sort of quite ridiculous story, and it was clearly someone having an opinion that was very uneducated, what that actually did was make them have to address it. So soon after, there was they went back in and they had to address what was going on. And Professor Bryant went in and spoke and talked about, this is a real problem and we need to start and look at it. So although it was bad, it was good that the media then, or that program then, were made accountable for some really interesting remarks. The media can be very good. This is, we actually started with Picking Up the Pieces in 2008 as a national awareness campaign, and our very first awareness event was to Trek Kokoda. Not that you'd know now, but yes, we did. And it was fantastic, and it was really good. We were quite surprised in how much support we had in terms of our uniformed services. So all the people that you're seeing sitting along there are either some are ex-military, Vietnam veterans, we have police, we have nurses. We have a young girl there who lost her partner to suicide. He was 26, that was devastating. And firemen and a whole bunch. So it was really good to get a really good news story. I know in terms of some of the stuff that we've done ourselves, and I've been really well rewarded in terms of accolades for doing some of this work. And what that does is bring media. And I found it really disheartening that the media only wanted to come to us if we were able to provide them with a, well, what happened and how devastating was it? And are you angry at the organisation? Are you this? And that's not what we wanted to do, because that is just going to fuel the bad stigma. So you will only find, sometimes media gets represented without you knowing, but you know, we will only ever try and do media interviews that we know is going to have a positive spin, because I think it just fuels the stigma. So, social media, the good, the bad and the ugly, and I call it this. Social media, I think, is good and bad. I'm going to put up a slide, but it has got some pretty bad language on it. Not really bad, but a little bit of bad language. But this concerned me. So on here, we've got Commodores are a lot like mental patients, always making strange noises and shitting themselves. What scared me about that is, I'm a bit of a Commodore lover, that's one thing. But the other thing is, when you think of our suicide rate and who it is affecting, 75% of them is males. So we're looking at a car. So that is probably one of the worst messages that you could fly around the internet that I have ever seen. And I was really devastated. And there's no shortage of them, trust me. But then we look at it the other way. Oh, you think people with mental illness can just snap out of it? Why don't you go and tell someone who is deaf to listen harder? And I went, well, that actually makes a bit more sense to me. Along with social media is, you know, I've tapped into a couple of resources where I will, Picking Up the Pieces doesn't have a Facebook page. We all have LinkedIn, but we don't have a Facebook page, and there's a very strong reason behind that, because we don't have the time or the resources to police anything that negative might be on there. But I have tapped into other resources, and some are absolutely fantastic. One in particular is it's a support group for partners of people that are suffering, whether they be emergency service or military. And some of the stuff that comes out of that is fantastic. People can just get on there and they can have a vent. Someone can say, yeah, well, I was going through the same thing. They talk about all sorts of different issues, from everything from sexual dysfunction to anger issues to a whole bunch of things. And it's a really, really good support network. But then there's another one that I've tapped on that does nothing but feed negativity into, well, they're doing this and they're not looking after this and they won't do this. So it's sort of, you know, I don't know how to disengage the negativity around that. And I guess that's just going to come through education and awareness. We have posters that we promote out, and these are only just the very beginning. We're hoping to release some more in Mental Health Week. And what we're trying to do is, or what we are doing, and it's been quite successful, is you look at the military one and you look at the fire one, and it's a bit depressed and everyone's not feeling so well. This seeking help is a sign of strength. Mental health education is as important as learning how to stay safe on the battleground or the fireground, whatever it is. Most people will look at that and think that's in aid to help people come forward, but it's actually not. Our whole idea around that is to put these messages out around organisations for people to start thinking about it, for people to start and look at it, so that if they are seeing someone or they do come across somebody, they have a much better idea of what they might be going through. So the next series of information that we will send out will be, you know, wellness, health and wellbeing, etc., etc. So we do the same with police. We talk about resistance, resilience and recovery, and these all map into the education that we've been doing, and it has been really, really quite successful. So pretty proud of those. I just want to talk about this, and this is a very basic slide. Probably looks a bit weird sitting up there. I was approached probably 2 weeks ago by a lovely young man in Canberra who's taken on a new role in terms of looking at trying to implement a mental health strategy within a workforce that's never ever had a strategy. It's a blue and white collar organisation. They've gone through a name change and a whole structural change. And he's in there with how do we implement a strategy and what do we do? So obviously this is just a tiny little snippet of something that he went through. I read through the document and made various sort of suggestions and bits and pieces from there. And this was sort of something that really, I really needed to get through to him is, you know, is the language that we're using creating more stigma? So one of his strategies was, we want to support workers recover from mental illness. And that's probably okay, because if somebody is mentally ill, that's exactly what you want to do. You want to support them, you want to try and get them back into their roles. We want to get them back into their roles sooner rather than later. We know that sitting them at home is the worst possible thing that can happen. So I like that idea. And I asked him to have a look at the next one, which was increasing awareness of mental illness and reducing stigma. And that sort of didn't sit well with me, because we don't want to increase awareness of mental illness. We want to increase awareness of mental health and wellbeing, and we want to reduce the stigma. And once I was able to get that concept through, he actually really understood it. So I think in terms of organisations and bits and pieces, that's something that we really need to look at, is the language that we use. I'm flying through this because I'm aware of the time. So addressing PTSD stigma, and I don't believe this is just PTSD, I think this is overall mental health stigma. Education challenges inaccurate stereotypes and replaces myths about PTSD with factual information. So we know that, and this is why I believe some of the work that we've done with the lived experience. I know we, with the evaluations that we've done, we've evaluated every single session that's been delivered out through picking up the pieces. And the lived experience is the one thing that has been coming back in terms of providing accurate depictions of what's going on. So we know that. Interpersonal contact involves a direct interaction between the public, employees and people diagnosed with PTSD and associated illnesses. Back to our media, when we were talking about there, sadly our media has depicted people with PTSD as, you know, raving psycho lunatics that are going to go around and shoot up the world, and if you've been in the military you're stuffed in the head and that's going to be it for the rest of your life. And that is not true. That is so far removed, it's not funny. So if we put people with mental health difficulties in front of an audience, they are really, really, you know, it's quite captivating to hear their stories. You know, we've got some very, very brilliant people that suffer PTSD, we know we do. Influencing attitudes and behaviour. So we look at protesting. Patrick Corrigan is probably, in terms of looking at addressing mental health stigma, is, you know, I have him on a pedestal up here, and I was privileged enough not only to meet him at the World Stigma Conference, but to actually go into Chicago and sit down and have a really, really good, thorough conversation with him on, well, how do you think that we address this, you know, issue of stigma within a uniform service culture? And how do we influence these attitudes and behaviour? And he has three main basic strategies. And as I said, if I was to go in and talk about all the things around stigma, it is a 4-day conference, just that on its own. So I'm hoping one day we'll get a World Stigma Conference here in Australia. Influencing attitudes and behaviour. So I think in terms of that, he says contact with people with mental health difficulties, education, as we've said up the top, and the other one that he talks about is protesting. If it is wrong and it is not sitting within, you know, all sorts of guidelines, then it needs to be addressed. And he calls it protesting. I don't know if protesting, if that's a bit of a strong word, but maybe, you know, maybe it is the word that we need to do to start and have people accountable for some actions that might not be so savoury. That's being very diplomatic. And looking at system level reform and change, how do we do that? So we need to do that again through education. We really do need to have reform and looking at the way things like insurance is handled, the way people that are discriminated against in a workplace or out in the community or whatever it is. We need to have these things really, really looked at, and there's legislation put in place. It's time that we actually utilise that legislation. Looking at changing policies, that will come back down to hopefully when we have a discussion to where from here after tomorrow, you know, where do we go from here? Maybe this is something that we can look at and change some systems and policies around addressing stigma and some sort of accountability, and promoting accountability. So, and when I say accountability, I'm a big believer that I don't think anybody purposely goes out, and certainly organisations do not go out to ever, you know, discriminate or hurt or you know, stigmatise their people at all, not in a million years. There's been enough money thrown into various organisations. It's got to come from that leadership and filter down through education, and it's got to be, I almost think, an individual responsibility. You know, people do need to be held accountable for poor behaviour if that's leading on to discrimination and sort of issues around that. Mental health strategies need to be sustainable, we know that. Peer reviewed is always very good, and developed collaboratively and then implemented. So these are all very basic things that I would imagine that the majority of people in this room would have a fairly good handle on. So I have a bit of a take-home message, and I'm sort of flying through this pretty quick. Addressing stigma is a preventative health measure. We really need to look at it and look at further research, further research, further methods for addressing it. And to do this, we need the collaboration of many. I was very, very thrilled when I heard that this forum was taking place. We looked at, we've done some various awareness events in Canberra and had, many people attend, but the people that were attending were people that were already au fait, that were understanding of it, that were keen to see a change, keen to get behind it. What we want to do through education and solid leadership is get other people on board with it, and that comes through the education. So that's why we changed our tactics from having big awareness events to actually going into a room and going one by one and changing the culture and the talk around mental health. Solid mental health leadership, and I'll just bring these up. This was a huge thing that came out of the Stigma Conference was, we need solid mental health leadership, and it's got to stem from the very, very highest of our leaders. So we had our Prime Minister talking about today, so that is a really, really, really good start. We have a lot of heads of organisations here today talking about PTSD and how do we address that. So that's a really, really, really good start. Without solid mental health leadership, it's just never going to change. We've got to look at changing a culture around mental health. I often say, I think this is probably the nurse in me, I think sometimes we pathologise too much around PTSD instead of normalising. We put people in harm's way, it's going to happen, something's going to happen, someone's going to be unwell. It's almost a normal thing. It's how we tackle that and how we deal with that when it does. So governments, workplaces, communities. In our education session, we talk very much about language and conversations and what that means. And it starts at the boardroom. It starts at the Coke machine when you're having a drink, buying a drink, in the lunchroom. We will talk about conversations in terms of, let's take, for instance, we've gone out and we're talking to a bunch of firemen, and they might talk about somebody that may be off in the head bin. If they're in a conversation in that truck and they've talked about Jim being off in the head bin, anybody that's been in that truck that's heard that negative conversation about Jim being off in the head bin, anybody that's in that, if they hear that conversation, if they start to have troubles, they will not want to come forward because they've heard how their colleagues are talking and discussing mental health. So we play a really, really strong role in that stigma and reducing stigma around the conversations that we have. If we can turn them to a more positive conversation instead of a negative, it's going to have a far better outcome in having people come forward earlier and then not suffer the really long-term effects. Changing how we see social inclusion. I really, really believe that some of the best assets in an organisation to look at this and addressing stigma are the people that are actually diagnosed with PTSD. And I can say that from actually probably personal experience. I watched a man that I'm married to be exceptionally unwell, incredibly unwell, and yet I watched him turn around and deliver the best education session to 130 of the burliest fireys down in Melbourne Fire Brigade that I'd ever seen. And he is an exceptionally good asset in terms of breaking down stigma. He's honest, he's clear in the message that he's talking about, and he wants to see a difference. And I think you'll find that the majority of people really, really do want to try and get better, get well, get out, don't want to lose their positions, don't want to lose their careers. And I've seen that time and time and time again with conversations that we've had in terms of people coming to us for support. Their biggest fear is, I'm going to lose my job. I'm just going to lose my job. So if we can remove some of that fear and have them come forward earlier, I think that that's probably going to be a little better. Peer-driven projects, we talked about that. I think peer-driven projects are really, really essential in terms of, look at our CISM, or not so much CISM, but our peers are our best bet because they can walk the walk, they can talk the talk, they've been in there, people will listen to them. And I think if we can bring in the peer-driven projects alongside our researchers, our professionals, our psychiatrists, our psychologists, and all the people that we need in terms of help seeking, I think, and collaborate it together, it's going to have a much, much better effect at trying to reduce the stigma and have people come forward. So I went through that pretty quickly, I'm fairly mindful of the time. I think in terms of looking at stigma and what it is and the effects and how damaging it is very damaging. I've seen that you know, not only from a perspective in terms of the organisation and the people that come through. We're auspiced by the Veterans Support Centre in Canberra, in Belconnen. They do an amazing job, but 96% of those people in there would have PTSD, and they're just absolutely gorgeous. But you can see that stigma has played a huge role. So to combat stigma and discrimination, I think we first must make them visible, and that is a statement from Patrick Corrigan. So on that, I'll just sum it up, and you know, it was pretty quick, very, very basic overall in terms of stigma and the effects of it. It's pretty huge. And hopefully when we come back to this forum again, whether it be next year or whenever the next one is, we'll have moved that much further in advance. So thank you for having me. Thank you. Is that all right to do?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could thank Katie once again.